She pressed her hands against her swollen belly and felt nothing. No kick, no flutter, no movement at all. Zofia had survived the Nazi invasion of Poland. She had survived the forced labor camps. She had survived the brutal winters, the starvation, the endless fear. She had survived the long journey across the Atlantic Ocean to America in 1945. But now, standing in an enemy camp in Texas with her hands on her stomach, she was certain her baby was dead inside her. She had been told the Americans were cruel. She had expected them to let her suffer alone. Instead, a young doctor in a white coat placed a cold metal stethoscope on her stomach, listened carefully with his eyes closed, and then smiled. "There it is," he said. Strong heartbeat. Zofia collapsed into sobs, not from grief, but from something she had forgotten how to feel. Hope. This is a story about mercy in the most unexpected place. If stories like this move you, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more true accounts from World War II history. These forgotten stories still have the power to change how we see the world. The summer of 1945 was one of endings. In Europe, the guns had finally gone silent after 6 long years. Cities lay in ruins across the continent. Families searched through rubble for the living and the dead. Smoke still rose from bombed factories. Rivers ran dark with ash. And in the chaos of a broken continent, thousands of displaced people found themselves caught between worlds, no longer prisoners of one regime, but not yet free. Among them was a group of Polish women. They had been taken from their homes during the Nazi occupation, some as forced laborers in German factories, others as prisoners in work camps that worked them nearly to death. Many had spent years operating machines that built weapons for a war they never wanted, their hands raw and bleeding from endless shifts. Now, with Germany defeated and the Third Reich collapsed into dust, they were classified as displaced persons and shipped westward under Allied control. Zofia Kowalska was 23 years old. She had dark hair that fell past her shoulders in tangles, though it was now unwashed and knotted from weeks without proper care. Her dress, once a pretty blue that her mother had sewn for her, had faded to a lifeless gray. The fabric hung loose on her thin frame except where her belly pushed outward, round and tight with 7 months of pregnancy. The child's father had been Zofia's husband, Tomasz. He had been shot by German soldiers 2 years earlier on a Warsaw street during a routine patrol. His crime had been looking at a soldier the wrong way. Zofia had not even been able to bury him. She had watched from a window as they dragged his body away, and that image, his arms trailing on the cobblestones, haunted her still. Now she stood on the deck of an American transport ship as it pulled into a port she did not recognize. The Statue of Liberty rose in the distance, green and strange against the morning sky, her torch lifted high. Around her, other Polish women whispered prayers under their breath. Some wept silently. Others stared in complete silence, their faces empty. None of them knew what awaited them in this country they had only heard about in stories and propaganda. The air smelled different here. That was the first thing Zofia noticed as she drew breath on deck. It was salty from the ocean, yes, but also somehow cleaner, free of the smoke and ash that had hung over Europe for years. There was no smell of burning buildings, no smell of death that had become so familiar she no longer noticed it. Just salt and wind and something that might have been flowers from the distant shore. Seagulls screamed overhead, white against the blue sky. The engines of the ship rumbled beneath her feet, vibrating through her worn shoes. And in the harbor she could see buildings that stood tall and unbroken, windows that still had glass, streets that had not been torn apart by bombs. It seemed like something from a fairy tale, a world where war had never touched. It seemed impossible. It seemed offensive. Back in Poland, her hometown had been reduced to rubble and ash. She had walked past corpses rotting in the street because there was no one left to bury them. She had eaten soup made from potato peels, boiled weeds, and whatever scraps she could find in garbage heaps. And here, across the vast ocean, the world looked completely untouched. This American wholeness, this impossible peace, made her chest tight with emotions she could not name. The women were marched down the gangway in a long, shuffling line. American soldiers stood on either side of the walkway, rifles casual at their shoulders but not raised in threat. Their uniforms were clean and pressed without patches or holes. Their boots were polished to a shine. They looked like men who had never gone hungry, never slept in fear, never watched their families die. Zofia kept her eyes on the ground as she walked, her hand resting protectively on her belly. The baby kicked once, weakly, then was still. "They will separate us, Wormai," whispered Marta, the woman walking beside her. Marta was older, maybe 35 years old, with deep lines around her eyes that made her look at least 50. She had lost her husband and 3 children to the war. Her voice was barely audible. "They will take the pregnant ones somewhere else, somewhere worse. They always do." Zofia said nothing in response. She had learned long ago not to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope was a weakness that could destroy you. Better to expect the worst and be surprised when it did not come than to expect kindness and be shattered when cruelty arrived instead. The women were loaded onto buses with hard wooden seats that hurt their thin bodies. The windows were small and dirty, letting in only fragments of light. Through them, Zofia watched America roll past like scenes from a dream. Green fields stretching to the horizon, neat wooden houses with painted shutters, children playing on lawns with dogs running beside them. A boy on a red bicycle waved at the bus as it passed. Some of the women waved back weakly. Zofia did not. She did not know how to respond to kindness anymore. The journey took hours, or maybe days. She could not tell anymore. Time had become strange during the war, stretched and compressed in ways that no longer made sense. Minutes of terror lasted for years. Months of waiting passed in what felt like moments. At some point during the trip, Zofia fell asleep with her head pressed against the dirty window, her hand still resting on her belly, dreaming of Warsaw before the bombs fell, when the streets were full of music and her mother sang in the kitchen. Wait. The fear lingered. Every bump in the road felt like a step closer to something terrible. Every mile carried them deeper into enemy territory. The camp was in Texas, surrounded by flat land that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. There were no mountains, no forests, nothing to break the endless horizon. The sky was enormous, bigger than any sky Zofia had ever seen in Poland, where church spires and rooftops had always framed the view. Here the sky went on forever, blue and burning with summer heat. Heat rose from the ground in shimmering waves. The air smelled of dust and dry grass and something sweet, like wildflowers she did not recognize. It was hot, hotter than Zofia had ever experienced. The sun beat down without mercy, and within minutes of stepping off the bus, her dress was damp with sweat. The gates of the camp were made of tall chain-link fence, topped with coils of barbed wire that glinted in the sunlight. Guard towers stood at the corners, manned by soldiers who watched the arriving buses with rifles ready. It looked from the outside exactly like every other camp she had known during the war. Her heart sank into her stomach. Another prison, another place of suffering. She had simply traded German captors for American ones. But then something strange happened. Something that made no sense. An American officer approached the group of women. It was a woman. Zofia had not expected that. She had never seen a female officer before. The woman wore a crisp uniform and carried a clipboard. She spoke slowly, her words translated by a man who knew a little Polish and German and could bridge the gap between languages. "Welcome," the officer said, and the translator repeated the word in Polish. "You will be processed. You will receive clean clothes. You will receive food. You will receive medical attention. Please follow the nurses." Zofia waited for the catch. There was always a catch. Processing in the German camps had meant something very different. It had meant inspections, humiliation, sometimes worse. She tensed, preparing herself for whatever was coming. The women were led into a long, low building. Inside, it was cool, blessed relief from the Texas heat. The floor was clean concrete. The walls were painted white. The smell was of soap and antiseptic, not sweat and fear. They were asked to remove their clothes, gently asked, not ordered at gunpoint. There were no shouting guards, no threats, just nurses in white uniforms, speaking softly, waiting patiently. Zofia's hands shook as she undressed. Her pregnant belly was now exposed and vulnerable, and she wrapped her arms around herself instinctively. She stood naked with the other women, waiting for the humiliation to begin, waiting for rough hands and cruel laughter. Instead, a nurse, an American woman with red hair and freckles scattered across her nose, handed her a clean white towel. The nurse smiled gently and said something through the translator. "Take your time. The water is warm." Zofia stepped into the shower room. The water hit her skin, and for a long moment she could not move. It was warm. Actually warm. Not the icy buckets she had grown used to in the labor camps, not the freezing river water she had bathed in during the occupation, teeth chattering, skin turning blue. This was heated water, flowing steady and clean, washing away months of grime and fear. She was given soap, real soap, white and fragrant, not the harsh brown blocks that had scraped her skin raw in Germany. This soap smelled like flowers. She lathered it in her hands, watching the white bubbles form between her fingers, unable to believe what she was seeing. Then she pressed the soap to her face and inhaled deeply, and the smell of lavender filled her lungs, and she began to cry. She was not alone in her tears. All around her in the steam, other women were weeping, quietly, privately, their shoulders shaking as the warm water ran over their bodies. These were women who had not cried in years, women who had learned to swallow their grief like stones, women who had been beaten for showing weakness. But here, in this small, unexpected mercy, something inside them broke open. After the shower, Zofia was given clean clothes, a simple cotton dress, soft and gentle against her scrubbed skin, and underwear that fit properly, and shoes without holes in the soles. She dressed slowly, running her fingers over the fabric as if it might disappear if she stopped touching it. They gave us soap, warm water, clean dresses that smell like sunshine. I keep waiting for the trick. I keep waiting for the cruelty to begin. But it does not come. I do not understand this place. I do not understand these people. The mess hall was a long building with rows of wooden tables and benches stretching from one end to the other. The smell hit Zofia before she even entered through the door. Bread, real fresh baked bread and something meaty and rich, and coffee, dark and strong. The aroma wrapped around her like a physical force. Her stomach cramped painfully with hunger. She had not smelled food like this in years. The women filed through a line, shuffling forward slowly. Behind a long counter, American cooks in white aprons and tall hats ladled food onto metal trays. Zofia watched the woman ahead of her receive her portion, and her mind could not process what she was seeing. A thick slice of white bread with butter melting on top, a generous scoop of mashed potatoes with gravy, a piece of chicken with brown skin, a pile of green beans glistening with butter, and a cup of hot coffee with real sugar. It was more food than Zofia had seen in a single meal since 1939. It was more food than her entire family had eaten in a week during the worst of the occupation. When she reached the counter, the cook, a large black man with a kind, weathered face and hands the size of dinner plates, looked at her swollen belly and added an extra slice of bread to her tray. "For the little one," he said, though she did not understand his words. The translator explained, and Zofia felt her throat tighten so much she could not speak. She carried her tray to a table and sat down heavily on the wooden bench. Around her, the other women were already eating, some slowly, savoring each bite as if it were sacred, others frantically shoveling food into their mouths as if it might be snatched away at any moment. Zofia just stared at her tray. Her hands trembled too much to pick up the fork. She picked up the bread first. It was soft, so soft, not hard and stale like the bread she had known during the war. She bit into it, and the butter melted on her tongue, rich and creamy, and the taste was so overwhelmingly good that she had to close her eyes. She had forgotten food could taste like this. She had forgotten that eating could be pleasure rather than survival. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she chewed. She thought of her mother, who had died of starvation in 1943, her body wasted to nothing but skin and bones. She thought of her father, who had been shot by soldiers for hiding bread. She thought of Tomasz, her husband, whose body had been dragged through streets where they had once walked hand in hand. All of them had died hungry. And here she was, eating bread with butter in the land of people who were supposed to be her enemies. "Eat slowly," Marta said softly beside her, her own eyes red with tears. "Your stomach is not used to this much food. You will make yourself sick if you eat too fast." But Zofia could not stop. She ate the chicken, pulling the meat from the bone with her fingers. She ate the mashed potatoes, smooth and buttery. She ate the green beans, crisp and fresh. She drank the coffee, sweet and strong and hot. And when her tray was empty, she sat staring at it in wonder, her belly full for the first time in years, her mind unable to process what had just happened. The baby kicked. Once, twice, 3 times. Strong kicks, stronger than she had felt in weeks, as if the child too was celebrating the feast. Zofia placed her hand on her belly and whispered in Polish, "Did you taste that, little one? Did you taste the bread? Did you taste the butter?" The baby kicked again, and Zofia smiled through her tears. That night, Zofia was shown to a barracks building. It was not luxurious. Rows of simple bunk beds lined the walls, and the wooden walls let in cracks of light from outside, but it was clean. The floor had been swept. The windows had curtains. The beds had real mattresses, clean sheets, and wool blankets. Because of her pregnancy, Zofia was given a bottom bunk so she would not have to climb. She sat on the edge of the mattress and pressed her palm against it, testing its softness. It gave way beneath her hand. It was actually soft. In the German labor camps, she had slept on wooden planks with only a thin scattering of dirty straw. In the displaced persons holding centers, she had slept on concrete floors with nothing but her arms for a pillow. But this was a real bed, a real mattress, a real blanket. "There are pillows," Marta said from the next bunk, her voice cracking with emotion. "Zofia, there are actual pillows." They sat together on Zofia's bunk, 2 women who had survived the unthinkable, holding pillows against their chests like treasures more valuable than gold. The absurdity of it, the sheer, impossible absurdity of being moved to tears by a pillow, made them laugh. And then the laughter became tears again. And then the tears became silence, the kind of silence that exists between people who have seen too much. Outside the barracks, the Texas night was warm and full of sounds. Crickets sang their endless songs. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played American music, strange and rhythmic. The stars were bright, brighter than any stars Zofia had ever seen over Europe, where smoke and fire had clouded the sky for years. She lay on her back, her belly rising like a small mountain beneath the clean blanket, and stared at the wooden ceiling. The baby moved again, a slow roll from one side of her belly to the other. Zofia smiled in the darkness. "We are safe," she whispered to the child she had not yet met. "I think we are safe here." But even as she said the words, doubt crept in like cold water. How could the enemy be kind? What did they want from her? She had been told her entire life that Americans were monsters, cruel, violent, interested only in power and money. And yet here she was, clean and fed and lying in a real bed with a pillow beneath her head. The contradiction gnawed at her. It was easier to understand cruelty. Cruelty made sense. Kindness from an enemy, that was confusing. That was dangerous. Days passed, then weeks. The initial shock faded slowly into something like routine, though Zofia never fully relaxed. Part of her was always waiting for the kindness to end, for the true face of the Americans to reveal itself. Every morning a bell rang at 6 o'clock. The women washed their faces, dressed in their clean clothes, and walked across the dusty yard to the mess hall for breakfast. The meals were always generous, eggs cooked in butter, toast with jam, sometimes strips of bacon that sizzled with fat, always hot coffee with sugar and cream. Zofia ate everything, forcing herself to take it slow, reminding herself that there would be more food tomorrow. After breakfast came work assignments. Because of her pregnancy, Zofia was given only light duties. She worked in the camp laundry, a warm building filled with steam and the smell of soap, where she folded sheets and towels into neat stacks. The work was easy, nothing like the backbreaking labor she had done in the German factories, where she had operated machines for 14 hours a day until her hands bled. Here she folded linens while American music played on a radio in the corner. And she was paid. Actually paid in camp currency called scrip that could be spent at the canteen. The concept baffled her completely. In the German camps, work had been punishment, survival, something forced upon you at gunpoint. Here, it was almost dignified. She worked her hours, received her small payment, and at the end of each day, she could use that payment to buy things for herself. The transaction felt foreign, like a custom from another planet. Other women had different assignments. Some worked in the vegetable gardens that surrounded the camp, growing tomatoes and beans and corn that would later appear on their own plates. Others helped in the kitchens, peeling potatoes and washing dishes. Some cleaned the administration buildings or helped with basic medical tasks in the hospital. The guards watched but did not harass. There were no beatings for working too slowly, no punishments for taking breaks, no selections where the weak were separated from the strong and sent away to die. "It is like a strange dream," Marta said one evening as they walked back to the barracks together, the Texas sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I keep thinking I will wake up and it will all be gone, that this will turn out to be a fantasy my dying brain created." Zofia nodded. She understood completely. The normalcy felt dangerous, like standing on the thin ice that might crack at any moment. But day after day the ice held. Day after day she was fed and sheltered and treated like a human being worthy of dignity. The camp canteen was a small wooden building near the center of the compound. Inside, shelves lined every wall, stocked with goods that seemed impossible, miraculous, like items from a fantasy. Chocolate bars in bright wrappers, packages of crackers, canned fruit swimming in sweet syrup, cigarettes in neat rows, bars of soap in different colors, combs and brushes, small hand mirrors with metal frames, writing paper and envelopes for letters home. The first time Zofia entered the canteen, she stopped dead in the doorway and simply stared. A woman from Krakow bumped into her from behind. "Move," the woman started to say, annoyed, then saw what Zofia was seeing and fell completely silent. "Is this real?" Zofia whispered. "Is any of this real?" It was real. She had earned enough scrip from her week of folding laundry to buy a chocolate bar. She picked it up from the shelf with trembling hands, turning it over, reading the English words she did not understand. Hershey's. The wrapper was brown and silver, smooth beneath her fingers. She opened it carefully, peeling back the paper as if it were sacred, and broke off a small square. The chocolate melted on her tongue, and she had to close her eyes against the sweetness. She had not tasted chocolate since before the war, since her 9th birthday, when her father had brought home a small box from a shop in the city. She had been a child then, innocent and happy. Now she was a 23-year-old woman, pregnant and far from everything she had ever known, eating chocolate in an American prisoner camp. The sweetness was almost too much to bear. She saved the rest of the bar carefully, wrapping it back up and hiding it under her mattress. Each night before bed, she would break off one small square and let it melt slowly on her tongue, making the pleasure last. It became a ritual, a small act of joy in a life that had known so little joy for so long. She was not alone in hoarding treasures. All over the camp, women kept their small prizes, a comb that made their hair shine, a mirror where they could see their faces becoming human again, a piece of candy saved for difficult days. These objects meant more than their physical worth could ever measure. They were proof that the women still existed, still mattered, still deserved small moments of happiness. But the abundance in the camp carried a heavy burden, a weight that grew heavier with each passing week. Letters began to arrive from Poland, smuggled through the Red Cross, passed hand to hand across a broken continent. The letters spoke of devastation beyond anything Zofia had imagined. Zofia received one from her Aunt Agnieszka, the only family member she knew was still alive. The words were written in a shaking, unsteady hand on paper so thin it was nearly transparent. "Dear Zofia, we are alive, but barely. The house is gone, burned to the ground with everything inside. We live now in a cellar with 3 other families. There is no food anywhere. The children eat grass from the fields and drink rainwater collected in buckets. Your little cousin Carol died last month. His body was simply too weak. He caught a fever and could not fight it. We buried him behind the church next to your mother. If you have anything at all, send it. Send anything. We are desperate, Zofia read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking so badly that the thin paper rattled. Then she folded it carefully and placed it under her pillow. That night she could not eat dinner. She sat at the table in the mess hall, staring at her plate piled high with meat and vegetables, and thought of children eating grass. The food turned to ash in her mouth. She could not swallow. You must eat, Marta said gently, her own plate untouched. She had received a letter, too. For the baby. The baby needs you to eat. How can I? Zofia whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. How can I put this food in my mouth when they are starving? When children are dying because there is nothing to eat? How can I grow fat on American food while my own people waste away? It was a question that haunted all of them, a guilt that never faded. They were prisoners, yes, but they were prisoners who ate better than the free people they had left behind in Europe. The unfairness of it was crushing. Some women stopped eating altogether, punishing themselves for their own survival. Others ate with tears streaming down their faces, their bodies demanding nourishment that their souls could not accept. The irony was unbearable. The Nazi regime had promised Poles only suffering and death. America, the enemy they had been taught to fear, had given them bread and safety. Meanwhile, Poland itself, the homeland they dreamed of returning to, had become a graveyard. Memory collided with reality. Everything they had been told was wrong. Everything they had believed was twisted. The world had turned completely upside down. Among the American guards at the camp, there was one who stood out from the others. His name was Thomas, a young man from Ohio, barely 20 years old, with sandy brown hair and a noticeable gap between his front teeth that showed when he smiled. He had been drafted in the final year of the war, but had never seen combat overseas. Now he was assigned to guard a camp full of displaced women who had seen more horror than he could possibly imagine. Thomas was assigned to patrol the laundry building where Zofia worked. At first he kept his distance, standing in the doorway with his rifle at his side, watching the women fold sheets with curious but wary eyes. But as the weeks passed and he realized these were not dangerous enemies but exhausted survivors, he began to relax. He would lean against the wall and watch them work, sometimes humming along to the songs on the radio. One hot afternoon he approached Zofia directly. She tensed immediately, her hands freezing on the towel she was folding. Her heart pounded. Guards approaching meant danger. That was what she had learned. Guards approaching meant pain. But Thomas only smiled his gap-toothed smile and pulled something from his uniform pocket. A small photograph. He showed it to her, pointing at a young woman in the picture. My sister, he said slowly, pointing at the photograph. Then he pointed at Zofia's round belly. Baby? Zofia understood what he was asking. She nodded slowly. Baby, she repeated, the English word strange and awkward on her Polish tongue. Thomas's smile widened. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out something else, a chocolate bar, wrapped in familiar brown and silver paper. He pressed it into her hands and said something she did not understand, but his meaning was absolutely clear. It was a gift, for her, for the baby. Zofia stared at the chocolate, then looked up at the young American soldier. He was not much older than her brother had been, her brother who had died fighting in the Warsaw Uprising, shot down in a street barricade. She remembered how thoroughly she had once hated Americans, how completely she had believed the propaganda that painted them as monsters. And here was this boy from Ohio, giving her chocolate, smiling at her belly. Thank you, she said carefully, practicing the English words she had been learning from the other women. Thank you very much. Thomas nodded, clearly pleased. You're welcome, he said. And then he returned to his post by the door, and Zofia returned to folding her towels, and something small but significant had passed between them. A moment of recognition of shared humanity across enemy lines, that neither would ever forget. Diary entry. The guard Thomas gave me chocolate today. He showed me a photograph of his sister. She has the same smile as he does, with the gap in the teeth. He is young, like my brother Piotr was. I have spent years believing I knew what Americans were. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Zofia's body grew stronger with each passing week in captivity. Her cheeks filled out with healthy flesh. Her hair regained its shine and thickness. The dark circles that had lived under her eyes for years began to fade, and her belly swelled larger and larger, the baby inside growing strong and active on American food. But while her body healed, her mind was at war with itself. Every kindness she received felt like a betrayal of everyone she had lost. She thought of Tomasz, her husband, shot dead in the street for nothing. She thought of her mother, wasted to bones, dying with the word hungry on her cracked lips. She thought of her father, executed for hiding a loaf of bread. She thought of Poland, broken and bleeding, while she ate chicken and mashed potatoes in Texas. How dare she thrive? How dare her body grow healthy while her people suffered? The guilt was constant, a low, painful hum beneath everything she did. When she ate breakfast, she felt guilty. When she slept on her soft mattress, she felt guilty. When she felt the baby kick, strong and healthy kicks, kicks that spoke of good nutrition and safety, she felt guilty most of all. She had survived. So many others had not, and her survival had come at the hands of people who were supposed to be her enemies. "You are being foolish," Marta told her one night. They were sitting together on Zofia's bunk after lights out, speaking in whispers so as not to wake the other women. The Texas stars were visible through the window. "The Americans did not kill your husband, Zofia. The Germans did. The Americans did not destroy Poland. Hitler and his Nazis did. Why do you punish yourself for accepting help from people who have done nothing to hurt you?" "Because it feels wrong," Zofia said, her voice cracking. "Because they are still the enemy. They are still foreigners. Because I was told all my life that they were evil, that they would use us and throw us away. And now they give me soap and chocolate and medical care, and I do not know what to believe anymore. Everything I thought I knew is broken." Marta was silent for a long moment, considering her words carefully. Then she said, "Perhaps that is the hardest thing of all. Not the hunger, not the fear, not even the loss, but having everything you believe torn apart and having to build something new from the pieces." "Kindness cuts deeper than cruelty," Zofia whispered into the darkness. "I understand cruelty. I know how to survive cruelty. I've been doing it for years. But this kindness, this unexpected, impossible kindness, I do not know what to do with it." She was not alone in her struggle. Throughout the camp, women wrestled with the same impossible questions. At night, after the lights went out, the barracks became places of intense debate, voices rising and falling in Polish, arguments about loyalty and survival and what any of it meant for who they were. Some women clung fiercely to their hatred. They refused to learn even basic English. They spat at the ground when guards walked past, careful not to be seen. They hoarded food under their mattresses, not because they were hungry, but because they wanted to reject American charity on principle. For them, hatred was a form of loyalty to everything they had lost, the only thing they had left that connected them to their dead families and destroyed homes. Others had given up on hatred entirely. They smiled at the guards and thanked them in careful English. They listened to American music on the radio and tapped their feet. They talked about staying in America after the war ended, about building completely new lives in this strange land of plenty. For them, survival meant adaptation, and adaptation meant releasing the weight of the past. Most of the women, like Zofia, existed somewhere in the painful middle ground, caught in a no-man's land of conflicting emotions they could not resolve. They ate the food but felt guilty with every bite. They accepted the kindness but could not fully trust it. They dreamed of Poland but feared returning to its ruins. One night, a woman named Helena stood up in the middle of the barracks and spoke in a clear voice that carried to every bunk. "We were told the Americans would rape us, murder us, treat us like animals. And what have they done instead? They have fed us good food, clothed us in clean dresses, given us medicine when we are sick. Either everything we were told was a complete lie, or this is all some elaborate trick. But I have been here nearly 3 months now, and I have seen no trick. I have seen only people, ordinary people who were raised to hate us, just as we were raised to hate them, and who have chosen not to hate us anyway." Silence filled the barracks like water filling a vessel. Helena sat down. No one spoke, but Zofia felt the words settle into her chest, heavy and undeniable, impossible to ignore. If the enemy values our lives, why do we not value our own? The question echoed in her mind long into the sleepless night. The transformation deepened when the women were finally taken outside the camp. Once a month, small groups were loaded onto trucks and driven into the nearest town for supplies. It was a strange arrangement, prisoners shopping in American stores, escorted by guards who looked almost embarrassed by the whole situation. But it was permitted under the Geneva Convention rules, and so it happened. Zofia went on one of these trips in her 8th month of pregnancy, her belly now so large she could barely see her feet. The truck bounced and rattled along dusty dirt roads, past farms where cattle grazed in green fields, until it reached a small town with one main street lined with shops and businesses. The women climbed out of the truck and stood blinking in the bright Texas sunlight, staring at a world that seemed to come straight from a storybook or a dream. The shops were full. That was what struck Zofia first. The impossible, overwhelming fullness of everything. Windows displayed dresses in bright colors, shoes of every style, toys for children. A grocery store overflowed with fruits and vegetables piled high, canned goods in neat rows, more food than Zofia had seen in all her years of war. A bakery sold fresh bread and cakes, the sweet smell drifting out onto the sidewalk. A pharmacy offered medicines, bandages, bottles of vitamins. Children ran past laughing, their cheeks round and pink with health. Women pushed baby carriages down the sidewalk, their own babies fat and content. Men sat on wooden benches reading newspapers, drinking coffee, discussing the weather. Cars drove by, shiny and new, their chrome glinting in the sun. There was no rubble anywhere, no burnt buildings, no bodies in the street, no hunger in anyone's eyes. Zofia stood on the corner and wept. She wept for her hometown of Lodz, which had once looked something like this and now lay in utter ruins. She wept for her mother, who had dreamed of seeing America someday and had died without enough food to survive another winter. She wept for Tomasz, who had fought so hard for a Poland that barely existed anymore. And she wept for herself, for the innocent girl she had been before the war began, and for the broken woman she had become. An American woman noticed her standing there crying. She was older, perhaps 60, with gray hair pinned neatly under a hat and kind blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She looked at Zofia's swollen belly, at her tear-streaked face, and said something in English that Zofia could not understand. Then she reached out and patted Zofia's arm gently, the way a grandmother might comfort a frightened child. "It's okay," the woman said softly. "It's okay, honey." Zofia understood those simple words. She had learned them in the camp. And standing there on that American street, being comforted by a stranger who was supposed to be her enemy, she felt something shift deep inside her, something ancient and heavy beginning to move, like ice breaking apart in spring. Perhaps captivity had revealed more truth than freedom ever had. It happened in the middle of the night, 2 weeks before Zofia's due date. She woke suddenly from a deep sleep, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. Something was wrong. She knew it immediately the way a mother knows. She lay frozen in her bunk, her hands pressed against her enormous belly, waiting for the familiar kick, the roll, the flutter of movement that had become her constant companion over these long months. Nothing. She pressed harder, shifting her position, trying desperately to wake the baby. She poked her belly. She rolled from side to side, but there was only stillness, a terrible, unnatural stillness that filled her entire body with ice-cold terror. "Marta," she whispered into the darkness. Then louder, her voice cracking with panic. "Marta! Wake up!" The older woman woke instantly, years of survival instinct bringing her from sleep to full alertness in a heartbeat. "What is it? What's wrong?" "The baby," Zofia said, her voice breaking into sobs. "The baby isn't moving. I can't feel the baby. Something is wrong. Something is terribly wrong." Marta's face went pale in the dim light. She placed her own hands on Zofia's belly, pressing and prodding, waiting and praying. Other women began to wake around them, sensing the disturbance. Whispered questions ran through the barracks like wildfire. "We need to get help," Marta said firmly. "The camp hospital. Right now." Zofia could barely walk. Her legs felt like water, like they might collapse beneath her at any moment. 2 women supported her on either side as they stumbled out of the barracks and across the dark yard toward the medical building, calling for help in broken English. A guard saw them and ran to open doors. Another sprinted to wake the doctor. The camp hospital was small, just a few beds, basic equipment, supplies for emergencies. But it had something Zofia had never had access to before. A trained doctor. Dr. Robert Miller was a young man from Pennsylvania, maybe 28 years old, drafted into military service and assigned to this remote Texas camp. He arrived still pulling on his white coat over his pajamas, his brown hair messy from sleep, his eyes alert despite the hour. "What's happening?" he asked, then saw Zofia's massive belly and her terrified face and understood immediately. The Polish translator who had also been woken explained rapidly in both languages. "Get her on the examination table," Dr. Miller said calmly. "Quickly but gently." Zofia lay on the cold examination table, her entire body trembling uncontrollably. She stared at the ceiling, unable to look at the doctor, unable to look at anyone. She was absolutely certain, completely and utterly certain, that her baby was dead. This was the price she had to pay. This was the cruelty she had been waiting for all along. God had let her eat and grow strong, only to take everything away at the last moment. Dr. Miller worked quickly but gently. He pressed his hands against her belly, feeling for position and movement. Then he reached for a metal instrument, a stethoscope, though Zofia did not know the English word for it, and placed the cold disc against her exposed skin. Silence stretched like eternity. He moved the stethoscope, pressing it to another spot on her belly. Then another. His face was focused, completely unreadable. Zofia's heart pounded so hard she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. She gripped Marta's hand until her knuckles turned white, until Marta winced with pain but did not pull away. "Please," Zofia whispered in Polish, the only language her terror would allow. "Please, please, please." Dr. Miller moved the stethoscope one more time, pressing it firmly against the lower curve of her belly. He closed his eyes, listening intently. The room held its breath. And then he smiled. "There it is," Dr. Miller said, his smile widening. "Strong heartbeat. The baby is absolutely fine." The translator repeated the words in Polish, her own voice shaking with relief. Zofia heard the words, but for a long moment her mind refused to process them. She stared at the young American doctor, completely uncomprehending. "The baby is alive," Marta said, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Zofia, do you understand? The baby is alive." And then Zofia broke. She sobbed, great, heaving, uncontrollable sobs that shook her entire body on the examination table. She sobbed for the terror she had just experienced, for the baby she had been so certain she had lost. She sobbed for everything she had been holding inside for years, all the grief, all the fear, all the loss that she had never allowed herself to feel. She sobbed for Tomasz, for her parents, for her brother, for everyone she had loved and lost. She sobbed for Poland. She sobbed for the girl she had once been. And she sobbed because an American doctor, a man from the enemy country, a stranger who owed her nothing, had just saved her world with a smile and two simple words. Strong heartbeat. Dr. Miller let her cry. He stood quietly beside the table, one hand resting gently on her arm, saying nothing but offering his presence. When her sobs finally began to subside, he spoke again, his voice soft and patient. The baby is probably just sleeping, he explained through the translator. Babies sleep a lot in the womb, especially near the end. Sometimes they're quiet for hours at a time. It doesn't mean anything is wrong, it just means they're resting. Zofia looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. He was young, probably close to her own age. He had kind eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses, and a gentle manner that put patients at ease. He had been woken in the middle of the night to help a Polish prisoner, a woman from a country he had probably never thought about, carrying a child whose father had been murdered by soldiers, and he had come without complaint. He had helped without hesitation. He had cared. "Thank you," she whispered, the English words feeling sacred on her tongue. "Thank you. Thank you." It was all she could say. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But Dr. Miller seemed to understand what she meant. He patted her arm and nodded. "You're going to be okay," he said gently. "Both of you are going to be okay." And in that moment, lying on a table in a Texas hospital in the middle of the night, Zofia believed him. 3 weeks later, in the same camp hospital where her fears had been quieted by a young doctor's smile, Zofia gave birth to a baby girl. The labor was long and exhausting, 18 hours of pain that pushed Zofia to the very edge of what she could endure. But Dr. Miller was there through it all, calm and steady, guiding her through each contraction with patience and encouragement. American nurses held her hands and wiped her forehead with cool cloths. Marta sat beside her and whispered prayers in Polish. And when the baby finally emerged into the world, screaming and red-faced and furiously alive, the room filled with a sound Zofia had not heard in years, genuine laughter. "A girl," Dr. Miller announced, placing the tiny, squirming baby on Zofia's chest. A healthy, beautiful girl. Zofia looked down at her daughter, this tiny, perfect miracle who had survived against all possible odds. Born in a foreign land, born in captivity, born into a world still broken and bleeding from war. And yet here she was, alive and healthy and demanding attention with her powerful lungs. "What will you name her?" Marta asked through her own tears. Zofia thought for a long moment. She thought of her mother, dead from starvation. She thought of Tomasz, shot in the street. She thought of Poland, destroyed but surviving. And she thought of the strange land that had given her soap and chocolate and bread and a doctor who found a heartbeat in the middle of the night. "Nadzieja," she said finally. Her name is Nadzieja. In Polish it means hope. Months passed like water flowing downstream. Nadzieja grew strong on American milk and vegetables and bread. She was a happy baby, quick to smile, slow to cry, adored by every woman in the camp. Even the guards softened when they saw her, passing along gifts of candy and soft cloths for blankets. But even as Nadzieja thrived, a dark shadow hung over the camp. The war was officially over. Repatriation programs had begun. Soon the women would be sent back to Europe, back to the ruins and starvation they had escaped. Zofia dreaded it with every fiber of her being. She dreaded returning to a Poland that existed now only in painful memory. She dreaded seeing the rubble where her childhood home had stood. She dreaded the hunger that waited for them, the freezing winters without heat, the endless struggle just to survive another day. Here in America, she and Nadzieja were safe, fed, protected, clean. Out there in the broken world beyond the ocean, nothing at all was certain. "They say we will be sent home soon. Home. What does that word even mean anymore? Warsaw is gone. My family is gone. The only home I have now is this child in my arms. And I fear for her. I fear what waits for us on the other side of the ocean." The day came too soon, as dreaded days always do. Zofia stood in the dusty camp yard with Nadzieja in her arms, watching the buses arrive at the gates. Around her, women wept and embraced and said tearful goodbyes. The guards stood at a respectful distance, their faces unreadable. Thomas, the young guard from Ohio who had given her chocolate, approached her one last time. He looked at Nadzieja, at her bright, curious eyes and round, healthy cheeks, and his gap-toothed smile spread across his face. "Beautiful baby," he said simply. "Thank you," Zofia said, meaning it for everything. The chocolate, the kindness, all the small moments that had added up to survival. Thank you for everything. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something, a small photograph. He pressed it carefully into her free hand. It was a picture of Nadzieja, taken by one of the nurses just a few weeks earlier. The baby was smiling in the photograph, her tiny fist raised, her eyes bright with the joy of being alive. So you remember, Thomas said slowly, making sure she understood. So you remember she was born somewhere safe? Zofia clutched the photograph to her heart. She could not speak through the tears. She could only nod. Zofia returned to Europe. She rebuilt her shattered life in the ruins, brick by brick, day by day. She raised her daughter in a world slowly, painfully healing from war. And through all the years that followed, she never forgot what she had experienced in that Texas camp. Decades later, when Nadzieja was grown with children of her own, she asked her mother about the old photograph, the one of herself as a baby, creased and faded but carefully preserved in a small wooden box. "Where was this taken?" Nadzieja asked. Zofia smiled, her eyes distant with memory. "In America," she said softly. "In a place where I learned that enemies are not always what they seem. Where a young doctor listened for your heartbeat when I thought I had lost you forever. Where soldiers gave me chocolate and guards gave me photographs. Where I learned that mercy can exist even in the darkest times. And that is why you named me Hope?" "Yes," Zofia said, touching her daughter's face gently. "Because they gave me hope when I had none left. Because they showed me that even when everything seems lost, goodness still exists somewhere in the world. And because you..." She smiled through tears. "You were living proof that life goes on. That new beginnings can grow from the ashes of destruction. That the future does not have to repeat the horrors of the past." For Zofia, that terrifying night in the camp hospital, the cold metal stethoscope on her skin, the endless silence, then the doctor's calm voice and gentle smile, became a symbol of something she had almost completely lost. Faith that goodness still existed in the world. She had prepared herself for cruelty. She had steeled herself for loss. Instead, she received care. Instead, she heard two words that changed everything. Strong heartbeat. Dr. Robert Miller did not have to help her that night. He could have waited until morning. He could have been cold and distant and simply done the minimum. Instead, he came running through the darkness, placed a stethoscope on a stranger's belly, and smiled when he found what she feared was lost forever. That smile. That simple human smile. It was worth more than any weapon ever made. Because mercy in the end is the most powerful force in the universe. It does not conquer through violence or fear. It conquers through connection. Through simple kindness. Through the recognition that the person standing before you, no matter what flag they were born under, no matter what language they speak, no matter what you were told about them, is human, exactly like you. Zofia lived to be 92 years old. She never returned to America, but she kept that photograph of baby Nadzieja until the day she died, a small rectangle of faded paper that held an entire world within its borders. Proof that she had been terrified and helped, that she had been labeled an enemy and shown mercy anyway, that in the worst of times a stranger had listened for a heartbeat and found one. Years later, speaking to her grandchildren gathered around her chair, she would tell them, "They did not just save my baby that night. They saved my soul. Because after everything I had seen, everything I had lost, everything I had survived, I had stopped believing that goodness existed anywhere. And then a doctor smiled and said, 'Strong heartbeat.' And I believed again. And that is the story worth remembering. It reminds us that war creates enemies, but humanity has the power to unmake them. That hatred is loud and angry, but kindness is ultimately stronger. That a heartbeat found in the darkness of night can echo across generations and change the world. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe for more true accounts of World War II history. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today. They remind us who we have the capacity to be, not at our worst, but at our very best. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because in a world that often feels dark and divided, we all need reminders that mercy still exists.